Thanks for joining us on today's webinar on how to triple your annual giving revenue by sending and calling less. This webinar will last 30 to 40 minutes and be followed by a Q&A. You can respond to the Q&A through the chat panel at the bottom right of the GoToWebinar control panel. So I'm Doug. I'm the President and CEO of Advisor Solutions. We're a business intelligence data analytics software company that does a lot of work in the fundraising area. We have over 200 clients in higher education, healthcare, and not-for-profits. You see examples from some of them today. As we get into annual giving, we also do a lot of work in major giving and prospect identification. So first is, why does annual giving matter? Well, obviously matters for a number of reasons. One is it produces revenue, which is key. It's also really key to attachment, which is also known as engagement or affinity. And every time we do predictive modeling on what helps somebody to step up their giving level into a major giving category, this is one of the most predictive factors. So it's really key to major giving cultivation as well as just revenue from the fund itself. As we get into this, we're going to look at both tactical and strategic considerations. We're going to cover tactical first and then come back and look at more strategic considerations. But there's a balance here of getting the right message out to the right media with the right timing and frequency and with the right prospects. And you'll see as we go through this storyline that when you nail this, you get higher yield, more revenue, more engagement, higher participation. If you miss up on this, it starts spiraling the other way, and there's a whole bunch of examples we could show where the wrong message with the wrong media, the wrong frequency, the people who just don't have inclination at all, it's just a lot of energy that probably doesn't produce much. So that's what we're going to take you through today. First, some definitions, because we're going to use these and they can be described different ways across the industry. There's an annual giving special term called LIBUNT last year, but unfortunately not this year. We're defining this as a current donor. So we mean in this case they gave in the last full fiscal year. So say it's now halfway through fiscal 16 if you have a June 30th year end. These would be people who gave in at least fiscal 15. They gave in the period ending last June 30th. So they're a current donor. A SIBUN is some year, but unfortunately not this year. So they're a lapsed donor is another word for it. So in our vernacular, they gave sometime, but not in the last full fiscal year. So back to this example, they gave sometime before fiscal 15, but not in fiscal 15. Then a non-donor is somebody who's never given. Now there are different definitions of these, I'm aware, and if we're working with a client, we'll adjust these definitions, but these are the ones we like because they let you snapshot a program, and you'll see in a minute, drill in on it in different ways. Then there's a current year donor who has given in this fiscal year. So obviously a LIBUNT may or may not have given in this fiscal year, same with a SIBUNT. And a non-donor who was a non-donor finishing last fiscal year could have been acquired this year and be a current year donor. So this is the piece that picks up what's actually happened this year. So let's look tactically at a dashboard. I'm going to load one up here. This is our software. And what it's doing is loading a full set of data that was pulled from a CRM system last night. This could have been Banner, Advanced, Razor's Edge, Blackbaud CRM, or whatever. And it comes up in a dashboard page in a web browser. I'm going to close this text on the right, which describes what the page is. This is a fairly typical front page, maybe. So we're looking at a program summary. Then we have 3 pages on the right we'll get into in a few minutes when we get more strategic segment trends, appeals, and touch points. There's a list of people, different giving categories, and a bunch of pages on the actual alums, map, affiliation, ratings, committees, degrees, and so forth. So that's our layout. So this first page gives you an indication that participation took a hit in 2012, but it came up nicely. It's been down a little bit, but stabilized above the target line. This is looking at this year versus last year. Last year is red. This year is blue. So we've been doing pretty good month over month. It's the end of the year. We got a little bit of work to do at the end of the year, but coming into May, we are kind of doing pretty well, and you can see cumulatively ahead of plan. Bunch of stats over here on the year, and then a list of the top donors this fiscal year. Looks like we got big donor at the top, and if I slide down the list, a bunch of non-donors and $50 donors. So that's everybody who's given this year out of my 55,000 potential. So now let's tactically look at a scenario. It's late May. In this scenario, we've got a month left. We have a call program. Let's see who would be the best possible prospects to put into the call program. So I grab my colleague and we look, well, down here we have current donors. These are people who gave the last fiscal year. Let's grab them. So I'm going to select them with the mouse, get rid of everybody else. I see that they subsplit into new donors, 5-year consecutive, 4-year. Let's grab the ones that have given 3, 4, and 5-year consecutive. So they've been giving all along. Let's drop in on them. And these are categories, you know, if we're working with one of you, we can obviously figure these out from the giving table, or sometimes they're calculated in a data mart or warehouse, whatever. We can work with what the data that's there. So now I've got 17,753 3+ year consecutive donors. The next thing we like to look at is when do they typically give. So there's a group, there's 3,901 of them that in the last 3 years have made a gift in the October-December period. Let's grab them because it's now, in this scenario, it's May. Get rid of everybody else. And then I've got some of them have already given this year. Looks like 3,574, but there's a group of them, 327, who haven't given this year. So let's grab them. So I've narrowed down, just by looking at the data here, to get 327 people who are 3+ year consecutive donors, have always given in October and December, but have not done that this year. Obviously, these, you know, heavy participation, 0 this year. That makes sense. This is their giving last year. There's no blue. They haven't made a gift this year, obviously. They did. Most of their giving came in, you know, in that period. Looks like there might have been a large gift from them in August. So here's my list. And go to the list over here. The more detail on this group, maybe you know, Gaylord DeGood. It's been the biggest total lifetime giving. Let's sort it by how much they gave last year. So this is the current year. Right now, this would be 15, 14, 13. I can see this, you know, this group has been pretty consistent. Not only have they been giving in each of the last 3 years, but they've given pretty well. Slide down. You know, here's some of the smaller donors. Well, there's obviously some people in here who I'd like to follow up with, and I might go a little further and say, you know, what degrees do they have? You know, here's degree decades. Institution, my college, some got graduate degrees from Harvard, there's MBAs, so I could subsplit the list and figure out who are the 43 that have the MBAs. Committees, let me go back to degrees. Yeah, so I could split by, you know, maybe if I want to grab the MBAs, I could just click the line, grab those 43, there's a list of them, and so forth. So there's a lot of things I can do at this level to subsplit my list and get down to the group I want. I can look at if they've been on committees. Here's my 327. Yeah, some of them have been active as class volunteers, alumni fund volunteers, participants. Did they play student sports and activities? Here's sports, crew, skiing. So if I'm trying to do something with this list of 327, maybe theme it a certain way, I can figure out from this degrees, you know, MBAs, medicine, sports they played, interests they might have at this level. But that's a good example of taking a dashboard, getting a snapshot, but then using it tactically to get some answers on an appropriate list to drive, given we've got, in this scenario, you know, 30, 40 days left to finish out the year. Those would be clearly the most attractive people. So if let's move from tactical to strategic, because typically the focus of an annual giving program has a top-line focus. Messaging goes to virtually everyone. The messages are fairly generic. It's a lot about, you know, it's time to give, or it's about a theme about the school. Not a lot of experimentation. Contrast this with what we would call top performers. They look at strategic metrics, and we're going to go through this in detail the rest of this presentation. They segment their prospects. For example, not all non-donors are the same. Some of them look more like the donors and are more likely to be acquired. Some of them are partway there, and some of them are probably highly unlikely to ever make a gift. If you can figure that out, you will get much higher revenue, much higher yield, even with fewer sends. We're going to look at that in a minute. Targeting messaging. There's some great examples of, if you know somebody's interested in sports, message them around sports. If they're interested in the health sciences, you know, it can be general contributions, but target the messaging. Then experiment and adjust. The top performers, especially with electronic media, can adjust and target and figure out what the interest area is by piloting things and then quickly adjusting, which is very different than sort of the typical behavior. So just looking at the top line, which is what a lot of, you know, annual giving programs look at. This is pretty good. It's a new program. It started, looks like, the early 80s, and it's kind of ramped up really well and continued to grow even through the recession. You know, what a story. But the question is this good or bad? It's good at revenue generation, but let's drill a little deeper. If you break this into two key subcomponents, you've got average gift amount, so the size of the gifts, and then you've got the number of gifts. These two combine to give you this line. And clearly, the average gift size has been going up. It looks like a high-end annual focus. It's a nice increase in gift size. We'd say great job. But a little more troubling, the donors are down by 1/3 in 5 years. So underneath the top line, when you disaggregate this, you see a potential problem. And what that does is it erodes the base. And if you look at participation in this relatively new program, you've got a weak and declining participation that had been at 6.3%. It's now down, the 2000 last year isn't complete, so it's running like under 6 now. That's a drop, and that's caused because we've a focus, conscious decision, maybe, maybe not, but the data helps you tell these stories. So as we look at this more strategically, we think there's 5 things that really matter. Top is participation. Am I growing my donor base over time? The second is probably at least as important, donor stability. Once I acquire a donor, how good of a job am I doing at keeping him or her? And then when donors do lapse, am I doing a good job of getting them back? Because the most costly thing is to acquire a donor and then lose them. I mean, you've done all the work to acquire them, and losing them is almost tragic. It's much easier to retain them than to reacquire them if they've been lapsed for a long period of time. The third is appeal yields. Is my messaging connecting with my constituents? Am I using the right media to reach them? And you'll see in a minute, in a program, there's usually a huge range of yield for different appeal messages and types. Touch points. Am I soliciting with the right frequency? We're going to look at this in detail in a couple minutes. And average gift size trends. Are my donors giving more over time? If it's working, they should be. And ultimately, some of them should be bubbling up to the major giving program. So let's tear into these. The challenge, looking at these things strategically, is established programs, and there's a lot of data and resistance to change. Established programs have been running. The teams are used to looking at things a certain way, and that certain way may not highlight strategic issues, looking at the top line versus looking at the pieces that make up the top line. There's tons of data, and untangling what worked and what didn't can be a challenging process, and that's where firms like us we're the data geeks, we can come in, kind of grab all this data and try to synthesize it into forums and interactive ways that make sense and you can understand it better. But also resistance to change. Habits, patterns, and inertia can get in the way. Teams are used to the established programs. Some team members can fear for their jobs if, for example, less is sent. And we have seen this in some of our clients where management gets behind a program, but then the staff that has to execute it pushes back for reasons that are valid. But so you really have to not just see the story and understand the program, but get the entire team from the top down into the people who have to execute it on board and realize that this mindset and just habits are going to get in the way. So we're going to go into these strategic metrics. First, participation, then donor stability, and there we mean retaining current donors, reacquiring lapsed donors when they lapsed, acquiring non-donors new, and then looking at the ratio of the current to the lapse. So there's a set of things under there that we'll get into: appeal yields, touch points, and average gift size. So here's this participation, which we saw in the dashboard a few minutes ago. It took a hit in 2012. It came up nicely. It's down a little bit, but not bad. And by the way, the note at the bottom, this is a mature program with high participation percent. Other newer programs will be lower if the trend lines in this we're looking on. So you can't compare this, an old, mature, really well-established program, with the one I showed just a minute ago with the declining participation because the fall off in gifts. That was like 5 or 6%, but that's a new program and in a bigger pool. So you have to watch how you cross-compare these. But the trending within an institution really does make sense. So this, again, there's 3 pieces to this. The participation's made up of how well are we retaining the current donors. And here it's fine. I mean, there was something happened in 12, but we got it back up, and they've been sustained in 2016. Is not yet finished. So great. How well are we reacquiring when they leave? Here it looks like a bunch left in 12, but we got them back in 13. But then, there's been a collapsing reacquisition rate since then, and this is not a good sign. It's down, well under. It's looking like 50% of the target here right now. And then the last piece is non-donor acquisition, and obviously the percentages here are going to be all different. But this year to date is terrible. It was okay last year, but we're almost through 16, and it's just about 0. So something's going on here, and that begs drilling in further and looking, which is what we're going to do over the next few pages, and then come back at that. So there's some trending issues. Let's drill in on donor stability as we try to untangle the trends. So you look at this, one thing we like to do is compare the level of the SciBunts to the LiBunts. And this is a not-for-profit that doesn't really have much of a non-donor base, which is why this is really low. This ratio here is 1.5 SciBunt to LiBunt, 5279 to 3559. That's terrible. 0.4 to 0.7 is good. And the problem with this is, the most expensive donor is the one that you lose and then don't recover. So we see these kinds of ratios a lot. And generally people, aren't paying attention to the lapses. And once they lapse a while, they're really hard to get back. Here's another example. This guy's data, but it's a top performer, where the ratio of the SciBunt to the LiBunt is 0.4. And there's a bigger non-donor pool because this is a higher ed institution with a bunch of alums who are in the pool versus a not-for-profit where, they're just acquiring the prospects when they give. So different scenarios here. But when I look at this SciBunt, and here I break it out, are they lapsed 1 year, 2 years, 3 years, 4 years, 5 years, or more? There's some lapse in a good ratio, and the lapses are short. They're not going long. So when we come back to the bad example in a second, you'll see that this balance is very different. So here's back to the first one. Here you can sort of see the recent lapses, which behave more like donors, are actually smaller than the long lapses, which behave more like non-donors. And we have done this, and a number of clients have modeled this, and it comes out every time that if somebody's lapsed for a year, year and a half, maybe 2 years, they look like a donor in terms of retention and the same messaging, and they missed the donation, they'll come back. Once they've lapsed more than 2 years, they fall off pretty quickly and disassociate and become more like a non-donor. So this ratio versus this kind of a pattern, this is a healthy pattern. This is low compared to that. That goes down as you go out. This is an unhealthy pattern. And, how to fix this? Well, what you want to do is scour the data to find best practices, appeals that work, regional differences, and so forth. So let's take this data another step. This thing on the right is called a spine plot. It's a fancy chart. But what you're looking at is this is a regional not-for-profit. These are states they work in. This is 0 to 100%, and the coloring and the percents are how much of their base of SciBunts and LiBunts are SciBunts. What percentage of their base are lapsed? And what jumps is, you got a bunch of stuff that's really high. Illinois is big, a lot of donors, prospects in it, but it's 70% lapsed. Michigan is pretty big, 72% lapsed. Ohio down here is only 10.4% lapsed. So when you look at this, what ideally would happen is what's different about Ohio? Can we take what we're doing in Ohio to the other states and drop the level of lapsed donors? So in this case, if you drill in on Ohio, you learn some things. They hold regional events. They leverage a famous person at their events. And after the events, they have frequent touch points with the attendees based on the event. And they focus the messaging around the themes that came out of the event. So they not only have events, but they have really cool events, and then they follow up aggressively on that events. Whereas these other areas are having events, but they're not the same power of event, and then the follow-up is lapsing. So you may get a donor right after the event, but if you don't follow up, they don't give again. A year goes by, 2 years goes by, and then they're into that long lapse situation, whereas Ohio is not letting that happen. So you'll see in a minute we're going to come to appeals and see some of the same patterns. But the beauty of this is the data has stories, and the stories have best practices, and the issue isn't, Michigan's doing bad, let's penalize Michigan. The issue is Ohio is doing great. Let's figure out what they're doing and get everybody else to listen to it and put them up as a hero and improve this performance and bring this yellow down so we improve that ratio. And then participation goes up, revenue goes up, all the good things happen. So let's look at appeal yields, that was a regional not-for-profit. Most of you, many of you aren't doing that, so this is another look at sends. So this is a group that's sending 34 appeal messages a year. They send out 855,000 appeals to roughly 55,000 people. This is how many get sent by quarter. This is the September quarter, December quarter, March quarter, June quarter, peaks in December. This is the yield of these 34 programs. So there's a target of 2%. 5% is awesome. There's a group of them over here that are clearing the 2% level, much like in that prior chart. You know, Ohio is doing good. These appeals are doing really good. Some in the middle, there's a whole bunch of them that aren't doing well. And then here's the media type: letter, personal letter, telephone, web, a lot of web. And this thing is called a heat map down here. So it's visually giving you a map of the effectiveness of the appeals. The size of each of these boxes is how many things were sent, and the coloring is the response rate from 0% to one of these things did 22%. So you can sort of see, just looking at this thing, that there's some green small things down here in class appeals. So there are focused things that did well. This green C thing here did well. There's a piece over here that did well. So it's a map. And one thing I'm also seeing, there's a lot of big red stuff. So this is going to a lot of people and is not doing very well. So I can take a mouse and sweep over the 7 of the 34 that are clearing the target. And it drops down and shows it compared to everything else. So again, the question that should come up is, what makes the ones that work different from everything else? Because we want to put them up as best practices and learn. Well, one thing over here, lower left, there's more personal letters. You can see the colored bar, which is what I've selected, is high in the number. There's 92,000 of them, and it's bigger than everything else. So that's part of the focus. Sent to known groups by class agents. So you can sort of see some of the bigger ones. There's an awful lot of things down here that are focused and working really well. This one, the green one there, is focused message for reunion classes. So it went out about a theme about reunion classes. There's another one over here that's a focused message for medical professionals. So there's a story behind the ones that are working. And obviously some of this is who you're focusing on and what the messaging is. So now I selected on the right, the right side. There's the 16 that are under 0.1%. 0.1% is pretty low, and there's 276 sends of these 0.1% and under appeals. So that's a lot of stuff going out. It's a third of all my sends have horrible yield. Again, if you look at this, there's heavy email, light on the other media, but there are, you can look at the numbers below, there's like 70,000 other things being sent out. There's a cost to this. And what we're getting is a general bland message to everyone. So we got some clues on appeals that might work, more focused messaging, smaller sends, more letters, less email, and some that aren't working. The next thing is, what's the relative frequency of touch? So we're going to look at touch points. These all work together. So you're going to ask, what is this chart? This chart are all the, this is an educational institution, so these are the ID numbers of the alums from, this person at the top got 1 touch in the last 12 months, so we're looking at solicitation over a moving 12-month period. And this one at the bottom got looks like 50 or so, and there's, kind of see there's a band in here. You're trying to get between 6 and 12 in a 12-month period. 25 of the constituents up here are under-touched by the entire program. There's a small group in the middle that's touched at the right level, and then there's a group of down here that are over-touched, up to 50 touches in a 12-month period. The blue is email, so you can sort of see the heavy preponderance of the heavy touching is by email. We see this pattern a lot, and I would say that over-touching, by touching 50 solicitation touches a year, probably doesn't build a lot of loyalty, and you may end up in a spam block. And down here, if you're touching people, a couple of times a year, it's just not enough. No, obviously, you got to adjust off if they made a gift on the first appeal. You might want to lighten up, but I don't know, this is sort of normal messaging from industry and the kind of thing we really recommend. So let's look at for this same group, what's going on with non-donor and long-lapsed. So it's almost the same pattern here of touches. Some are being touched a lot. They don't give, but they get touched a lot. Some aren't touched enough. This thing on the left is looking at the annual period. This is from May of one year to May of the other year. So you can sort of see there's emails happening pretty consistently throughout the year. There's some of these forms of publications. There's mail a lot of mail, a lot of costs going out. You can see it over here in the green. And then phone. There's some phone calls, but not a lot. So now let's drop this down. So I've just grabbed the 7 appeals that were working, but they touch very few of these non-donors, long lapse, and they do it very infrequently. You can sort of, it's hard to see, the little colored things in here are the 7 appeal groups that were working as they now relate to the non-donors and lapse, and the gray is everything else. These just basically are dominated by gray. If we zoom in on this, basically get rid of the gray, you can sort of see from my entire non-donor and lapsed pool, with the appeals that work, 2/3 of them get 1 of them, a little group gets 2, and there's a little group down here at the bottom that are 6 or more at the right level, and I'm willing to bet those may be the ones that get acquired. And you can sort of see the timing for the year. There's not as much email in these. It's a lot more. I mean, we saw this before. It's the mail and personal letters and some phone, not a lot of phone. So this is a pattern that would say, you know, we need to find a way to up the level of these effective appeals with the donors who are more likely to be acquired. So the question is, what do you do? Well, one thing you want to do is segment the non-donors, because one of the problems is if you send to everybody and you've got a mix of appeals, and some of them you might be experimenting with, it's hard to get the touches. And so what you want to do is study the non-donors who have recently been acquired. Who are they? What are their characteristics, and who else has similar characteristics? And generally, when we do this, we take a non-donor pool of, say, 500,000. Maybe 1/3 look like the donors, 1/3 kind of do and might give, and there's another 1/3, 40%, that are highly unlikely to give. And in an example, you can use predictive modeling to figure out what the characteristics of these people are. And generally, you know, recent graduates, and we probably want to break it at least in 2 groups. It's characteristics like, in this case, women live in New York, have degrees of these kinds. As they get older, they live in different places. They have professional degrees because they've gone on and got. So the modeling will actually tell you, out of the fields that you have, which let's say you have this, what creates a non-donor who looks more like the donors. And we note down here, then you score based on the weighted combination. Nobody's going to have all of these things, obviously. So there's a math that blends them together. So then what you want to do is, like, hold back. Focus on the ones who look like our donors with the appeals that are working, and cut out the others for now. And you'll be able to get your touch points up and get your yields up and get the results up. So here's a typical, not a typical, here's an action plan. If we just looked at participation, donor retention, appeal yield, and touch points. And out of this, and this is not atypical, we'd say cut back. Don't solicit everybody. Stop sending the ineffective appeals. Now, back to every time we try to do this, there's resistance because there's teams that send these things and they may not like cutting back. But the reality is you can actually be more effective. And we're going to see one of our clients' actual results in a minute where they did this and it worked. You got to select target groups, not everybody. So here we segmented the long lapse and non-donor pool based on characteristics of recently acquired non-donors. This group is about 130,000, or 30% of the total population. Then with them, you increase the frequency of the effective appeals, the 7 programs that have worked. Maybe model some more on those same characteristics. So you get 6 to 12 touches per person per year, not 50, not 2, but in a more reasonable band. Then use message themes that connect to their interest areas. And one question is, how do you figure out interest areas? You can, in the example we did at the beginning, we saw degrees, sports, committees. You get some feel from that. You can get some feel from the types of events they attend. They come to sporting events versus tutorials on neuroscience research. You get a feel for they like science or they like sports. What they click through on the newsletters. There's a variety of ways of picking this stuff up. And then experiment. There's a webinar that you see in a minute from the University of Florida where they created message themes around these kinds of things, and they've broken the messaging up into different themes and get higher yields because they're giving people messaging that's in an area they're more interested in. So taking that data and looking at it strategically, we get to action plans like this. It's another webinar we'll show you the link for in a minute we did last summer with Northern Illinois. This is right from that webinar, and in that webinar, Sandy takes through how they actually did this. But the problems they had, the solicitation schedules wasn't donor-centric. Timing, touch points, treating all of the lapsed donors the same way, and they found that the recently lapsed ones look a lot more like donors, and the long lapsed ones looked a lot more like non-donors, and then differentiated after that. Mailing to everyone versus focusing, and there was no analysis on the non-donors. So the data examples we just went through was very similar to what Northern Illinois was working with. And what they did, they looked at waves of giving throughout the year and adjusted telefund and mail and email schedules. They segmented the side months by the numbers of years lapsed. They mailed to far fewer people, and they used predictive modeling to split the non-donor pool into pieces, the ones most likely, the middle likely, and the ones that weren't likely. What happened was pretty phenomenal. In the link for the webinar, we'll see it in a minute again, but it's up on our website. The revenue went up 70% since 2012. The average gift size went up 60%. All major mail solicitations were sent to less people and made more money each of the last 3 fiscal years. I think you'd all love to have that. That's pretty awesome. They acquired 17% more new donors in 15 and 14. The first-time donor retention rate went up from 23 to 30%. With the holiday gift cards, they tripled the revenue in 1 year while sending 5,000 less pieces, which is 25% less. So, great example of how being strategic about this thing can work. So again, what we're looking at here is what we typically see, and we went through several data examples, is a top-line focus, messaging to everybody with generic messages and little experimentation. The top formers look at strategic metrics, and we went through a bunch of them. They segment the prospects, realizing they're not all the same. They target the messaging around interest areas, and they adjust and experiment and adjust. And you can do this pretty quickly. Obviously, if you experiment, the thing may not work, so then stop it. If you experiment and it works, do more of it, but just continue adjusting. And with electronic media, that's a lot easier to do than it used to ever be. Then we looked at, from a strategic level, we argue there's 5 things that really matter. Am I growing my donor base over time? Once I acquire a donor, how good am I doing at keeping him or her? When they lapse, do I do a good job getting them back? Appeal yields. Is my messaging connecting? Am I using the right media? You can measure that. Touch points. Am I soliciting with the right frequency? And we saw a couple great examples of where some people weigh little, some people weigh too much. And average gift size trends. We saw that back at the beginning. Are my donors giving more over time? And when we would argue, when you get this right, you get the kind of improvement we just saw in the numbers from NIU. So I'm going to move to a Q&A. I'd love to have more follow-up discussions because we do this work all the time and we have a lot of these best practices. I'd also suggest there's 2 webinars that will build on this, and they're up on our website, advisorsolutions.com. There's a tab at the top, resources, the page webinars, and you'll see it's going to open up the fundraising. The first one is annual giving, using existing data to segment messaging and improve results. It's with Northern Illinois University from like a year ago. And there's a second on donor retention, acquisition, and appeal targeting with University of Florida, which is a great story about targeting messaging and by doing that, getting yields up. So what kind of questions do we have? When you refer to touches, are those only solicitations, or does that include stewardship events, activities, touches? Great question. And the other piece would be, what about general mailings and alumni relations stuff? There were specifically, the charts I had, the 6 to 12 were solicitation touches. But we usually would put a filter in because you want to make sure that if that's in balance, then you also need to look at the rest of the touches from the institution because they all add up to some saturation level. So purists, we say 6 to 12 solicitation touches, but we would usually look at it in addition with the rest of the mailings and touch points that are coming to the population as well. What makes an email solicitation effective? Great question. Frequency. So in the examples we saw, one of the things, I'll start with what doesn't make it effective, is way too many. And we see that a lot. I mean, email is fairly cheap, so you just sort of launch things out. But if you're hitting people, more than once a month with a solicitation touch, it's too much, and you're going to end up in the spam filter. And so frequency is important, and then the interest area. The institutions that we've seen do this the best, focused on what somebody's inherently interested in, sports or science or arts and sciences or compassion and justice is one of the topic areas that's come up. If it's healthcare, you've obviously got the provider, the department area, the provider. Research that's being done in oncology, there'd be a lot more focused than just saying, hey, we're a great healthcare institution, give us some money. So figuring out those interest areas, and by the way, in healthcare, a lot of this was not-for-profit and higher ed, but we're doing more and more work in healthcare with HIPAA opening up on the ability to leverage patient data in fundraising. It's a whole new ballgame because you can model the department area, the provider, the treatment intensity, how many encounters there were, how long they occurred over, and those are quite predictive, and they also give you interest areas. So there's really a whole new day on that side. And if people like us who are data geeks, it's awesome. Well, you can literally there's a whole lot more we've just been opened up to over there. When segmenting appeals, when do you know you're over-segmented? Yeah. So let me just go back a few pages in here. Hold on to these appeal things. I mean, here's a map of all the appeals. So I'm going back a ways. So the question was, when you're segmenting appeals, how do you know you're over-segmented? And this heat map is sort of a combination of, what size population they're going out to. So this whole thing is 850,000. I'm going to PowerPoint, so it's not active. The brush-ups aren't working. But these things are like, 60,000, 70,000 a box, these big boxes. And these things are down at like a 500 level. So you're kind of seeing here, the bigger sends generally don't do well. The ones that are focused on a few hundred people, because this is coming from class appeals, so there's actually somebody they probably know or respect or have heard of, so it's got more of a personal. These things are generally doing well. This is a bigger appeal. This is like a 15,000 send, but it was focused on reunion years, so it's got a theme coming into a bunch of reunion people. I think one of these over here was a medical focused thing, so this is a group of like 10,000, 6,000 people with a medical interest, and it did relatively well. So a bit of a long-winded answer, but some of the message themes do go broader if there is an interest area like medicine, or like I'm coming to a reunion and something's happening there. And some of these things where it's some interaction with a person, you get the high yield when you focus it way down, and the institution obviously is helping these class agents do this, but you can sort of see the jumps, the green things here are much higher yield when you're doing that. So I think you need to be pragmatic. There's not a silver bullet for what the right size segmentation is. The same thing so this is segmenting the appeals and the messages, and when we segment go back here, the non-donors was the other segmentation we showed in here. How this breaks, I'd let the modeling do it, because it's gonna, if you take predictive modeling, and we would use the base population would be all the non-donors, and the target would be the people who were acquired, say, last year. So I don't know, if it's 4%, you're going to have 4% acquired against a pool of the rest of them. And the modeling is going to figure out which of these factors actually matter. It's also going to create some of the breaks between how to split this into 3s or 4s or 5s. I mean, our software would bin it usually into 5 buckets. You can bin it into 3, but it'll tell you, and you'll see. Is there a group that clearly jumps that has these characteristics? What's the next group look like? So part of this segmentation is, I'd say, let the data tell its story and then look at it and adjust to what it says. But in general, if you're looking at non-donor pools, that segmentation, generally we see like third splits. That being said, we'll probably find one tomorrow that's 2%, 80, whatever. So again, I think you got the point. When do you know you've sent too many touch points? Well, go back to one of these touch point charts. Here's everybody. Well, let's say that over 20 is too much. I mean, that's like 2 a month solicitation touches. And if you're hitting over with email, what's going to happen is you may not even know it, but you're going to get blocked by them, and you're just not going to put up with it in this day and age. So I think just this is too much. Is 12 or 14 or 15, that's sort of getting boundary conditions. But normally, if you look at the data this way, there's going to be some dramatic differences. And this you could chop some of this bottom part off and stick it up here. You'd be better off, and cut a lot of this out. So sort of like almost like a jigsaw puzzle where you can cut this thing apart and figure out how it might work better. But yeah, then again, like with the segmentation sizing, there's not a hard and fast rule here, but generally, people frequency 612 a year, once, twice a month. I mean, once a month, once every 2 months is a good frequency for something like this. It's similar, like, it's solicitation you're going to get from a mass. I hate to compare fundraising to mass marketing, but this concept here is similar. I mean, you're not going to get, like, if you got one a week, I can tell you what you'd all do with it. So that's the balance here. And that's the balance here. Are you able to integrate data from multiple data sources? Yeah, so great question. When I loaded up the demo, it had preloaded data. So when the thing came up, it took like 30 seconds, and you had that interactive thing I went through to find the 327 to call. The way we load data is we can load and mix from multiple sources. So typically, we're going to have a major CRM system like a Razor's Edge or a Blackbaud CRM or Agilon or a Banner Advanced Millennium, one of those. But also often there's data that's other places, like email click-throughs are usually, we're going to grab them from a spreadsheet or a text file or something, and there might be wealth information in a Forbes zip code download, but there might be event attendance that's not in Razor's Edge, so we're grabbing it from an access table or a spreadsheet. So that's all fine. Sometimes some stuff's up in the cloud. As long as there's APIs, we can grab that. So generally, when we're loading, we're mixing and matching, and the user ends up with the experience I showed you where they don't know where all the data came from. That's an automated procedure that Reload Ignite generally can load on demand and more frequently. But and then also those segment bins in the October, December donors. If we have the giving data, we obviously can figure that out after we load the data and we do calculations, and then the user gets a simple bar chart. They click the side bunts, they click the bars 3 to 5 or more years, then clicked October, December, and they click this year. So that's all stuff that just came straight from the giving table, but we did a bunch of calculations after we loaded it and displayed it in those bars. Obviously, that also could be done in the database. Sometimes clients have, more often it's not, so we'll just pull it as is and then do that. Do top performers have a formal matrix for the different types of touch points? I'm not sure I understand the question. A formal matrix for the different types of touch points. Oh, media. Yeah. So if it's media, so that's if the question is these touch points, do we want to look at it by media? We do. I mean, here we're like it's overall touch points, and then we've got the media colored in, so you can sort of get a feel for what's going on. That looks like 60% of the population getting a lot of emails, and 40% aren't. 40% are getting more mail and stuff. When we went to the non-donors, we saw actually very much the same pattern. It's undifferentiated. You might think here there'd be some split, but it doesn't seem to be. And kind of the media distribution seems the same. And you also see in this particular thing, like the phone is like really low. They just don't see. We look at it. So we look at the touch points by media kind of this way, and if the concept is to put this into a matrix or more of a text grid, we can do that as well. I mean, sometimes we'll almost always complement these kinds of visual charts with rows and columns of the numbers and percentages and what by the different media type and program types and people types. But the visuals like this help people see a story, and they kind of highlight it. If you put this in like a text grid matrix, it'd be hard to spot what's going on as quickly. Would you consider 1 email a day at the end of the fiscal year to acquire donors, 1 solicitation package, or 3? So this data is actually what we're showing here is organized. Let me go back on that a second into programs. So when we looked at the yields, it was actually a program. So if I go back a page, this heat map, you can sort of see what's going on. I'm going to answer this question a little bit long-winded. So this thing, Class Appeal, is a program, and it's composed of a bunch of appeals, some of which would be letters, mail, phone. So we suggest in some of the systems accommodate this, others do it less well, but the appeals that they grouped into programs or themes, and then often when we're going to look at yield, we're going to look at people the whole program was sent to who then gave. So some people are going to get an email, not respond, get a phone, make a gift. Then they might actually get a letter, but we count them when they make the gift. So we're, our yield is total for the program, and the program may have multiple sends within it. But so we're looking at it that way. Touch points, we're looking at how many things people are getting. So if the program actually has multiple appeal types and the person gets 3 touches, that we would count that as 3, not 1 because they're linked media. So to answer the technical question, 1 email a day at the end of the fiscal year, we would call that 3 touches. It might be part of 1 appeal program because it could be, one of these and one of these and one of these. If that makes any sense. I think it did. Next question. What are good next steps when you are lacking many of these data points? So I bet most of you actually have the data points because there's 3 key things to this. One is obviously the constituents, the people, the alums, the patients, whatever. And if you have any kind of a CRM system, you have an entity table. And then you can argue, do we want to group into households or not? So there's another discussion there, but the entity is the key. If you have appeal sends, that often could be in multiple pieces, like email sends maybe in one table, phone call maybe in another table, mail maybe in another table. That's fine. Those can be appended into one appeals table, but for this kind of analysis, you need a table where each row is a send to a person with a media type and some kind of a flag for the message or what the thing is. Most of the CRM systems do that, Razor's Edge, Blackbaud, in advance and so forth. But again, if that stuff, sometimes it's in spreadsheets or text tables or whatever, and as long as it's somewhere on a network we can get our hands on, we can start putting this together. And the third piece is the giving table. As long as we have the giving, and so on appeals, we like to go back 2 years with all the sends. You don't need to go back 5 years. It sort of becomes irrelevant. You want to look at trending over the last 2 years is pretty important. If it's 1 year, it's okay, but I bet most of you have appeal sends going back 2 years. Then giving, we'd like that back as far as possible. Looking at participation over 5 years, you actually need the giving over 5 years. We at least need 2 years of detailed giving, and presumably it's coded so that we can tell if it's an annual fund gift or something from another program. And then presumably if a gift comes in off an appeal, it's coded in the gift table. Usually our clients are doing that. If it's not, we can create rules for timing the gift credit around an appeal send. Like most of these things are fairly fast. If you send an email appeal out, the giving usually comes in within the week, not like 4 months later. So we can create rules and look at the data and try to link it together because you can get measures that way as well. But generally there's 3 key tables. Giving at the transaction level, coded for the annual fund, appeals at the send level, then entities at the person level. And I mentioned if we can group into households, all the better. If there's not key to that, we can work at the entity level. And I would add one more thing. If you're using, back to the tactical side of this, where we cut lists out, presumably there's a bunch of do not send rules somewhere that you have, which to the extent we would also get access and load them in, you can export the table out. Because when I created that list of the 327, I could have exported that whole table out, which had emails and had giving stats. You saw all of that, and it could also have had contact information and do not solicit filters on it. So you could have, some of our clients will take that list right out of us, so it loaded from, say, Razor's Edge overnight, pulled in some other stuff. In the morning, they go in and get their list of 327, export it out of Advisor, take the list, give it to the call center. Other clients would say, we actually would prefer to put the ID numbers back into the CRM system and let the CRM system work its magic with the rules and all that, and then the CRM system would give the list to the call center. Either way, but we've got the data, and then a couple of ways you can work with it. How up to date is the data? Do you refresh it daily, weekly? So we load data usually once a day in the middle of the night. So our software creates like a project file. It's kind of like Excel creates a workbook. We create a project file. And that thing will load data whenever you want it to. It can load on demand. It can load every 5 minutes. It can load once an hour. It can load once a day, once a week, once a month, whatever. Typically, for this kind of work, we'd load once a day because the databases are usually busy during the day, and you don't want to be, it's slower, and usually IT doesn't want the stuff pulled in the middle of the day. So we usually load once a day. We put like this big file somewhere that you then access it. I access it off a web server in a browser. You can access it on an iPad, a Windows PC client. We have different ways of running that file. But the concept is we generally would load once a day, although some of our clients load on demand and some load less frequently. Can you use social media as an effective solicitation strategy? Is social media more of an educational resource? So we don't. So yeah, we're the data people. We're trying to find. So social media conceptually has a bunch of information on people expressing interest and opt-in engagement and a bunch of other things about your institution. There's a bunch of firms saying they can do all kinds of beautiful things with it, but we are trying to get somebody to actually give us a data set that we can load and blend with the rest of the data and see what it is, and we've been a little bit frustrated to get under the talk. So I would say, I'll put this back, if somebody knows a firm that does a great job at taking social media and creating data that can be leveraged with the rest of the stuff that you already have, we'd love to see it because we'd like to partner with them, and we'd love to get our hands on that data. That's not our business per se. You know, we work with data that's from somewhere. And also, if anybody's, just for this webinar, if any of you are using social media in a creative way in annual giving, I'd love to hear about it. And you know, we're open to spreading the word because there's a whole group out there that I know would like to do that. And conceptually, it makes sense. We've had talking with a partner with LinkedIn. The problem is LinkedIn won't let you take the data away. So you can put your stuff to them and they'll do something, but you can't actually get the LinkedIn scores and relationships and interests back with the rest of your data. We got another discussion on Facebook, which is kind of the same way. It sounds good at one level, but you can't actually get the stuff. So yeah, great question. You got my email. Put my email back up. And let me know. I'd love to hear more about that. We're eager ears. Next question is, trending now, what is the best way for people to increase their donation? Would it still be phone as it has in the past? That's a really good question. So I'd let the data tell you, because this varies by institution, it varies by messages. So the issue is phone, email, mail, those different media, what works to increase, I would say, participation and also donations. And it varies. It depends by age group. So that's part of the segmentation process. And some of the data we had here was very light on phone. We'd probably argue put some more in, but you know, some segments of the population are not going to reply well to phone. So that's probably trickier than it used to be, and we can help untangle that, but that's also probably an ongoing process. And the webinar, the Northern Illinois University webinar, Sandy talks a bit about that. So that's another one where if you're going to get some kind of first-hand description from somebody who's doing this. Another question is call center analytics, which is so one of the media types is call centers. In call centers, we have done work there in addition to this, that what we know is different types of callers respond to different groups of alumni in different ways. So in addition to the messaging, it does actually matter when you call and who's actually making the call. And if you're using students, not every student's going to connect with every alum in the same way. And having an effective call center is another drill in on the data. It's a little bit of a tangent to this talk, but it's related because it's clearly one of the medias. So unlike a letter and an email, it comes in the same way every time. A call does actually really matter who the caller is and how they are connecting with their prospect. And it's so therefore in that way it's different than the other two media and probably a little more complicated. There's some of the call center hosters and outsourcers can help you with that, and if it's an in-house program and we can work with the data, we can help untangle that as well. Can the call center pull their own data using this story? Yes, so the answer is yes. If I go back, let's go back. The question is, can the call center drop down to their data? I'm actually not in the project. Hold on. I'm going to go way back to the beginning. It's a good question. So here's an example. If I want to look at what's happening with the call center, I'm going to go back to my actual dashboard here because the PowerPoint is not exactly interactive. So here's actually an example of load time. So this is like it's like 1 million rows of appeals. It's like 150,000 prospects, 600,000. So it's a bunch of tables preloaded. The start time for somebody coming in cold is like 20 to 30 seconds to get the data unloaded. We're running in RAM here on a server somewhere, and then it's going to come up in my browser. And if I wanted to see, the question was the call center effectiveness, I can go to my appeals table. And this is the charts you were seeing in the PowerPoint, except now we're actually looking at the actual live software. I'm going to hide this panel. It's still loading up. Still went from a cold start there, hide this panel. So here's everything over a several-year period. If I want to look at the telephone, I can click the telephone down here, and it drops to the telephone. And so it's what I'm showing first is the telephone colored in against everything else. And then if I go here, I can exclude the everything else. I'm going to drop to just my telephone campaign. So in this data set, a couple of things jump. I was looking at overall yields for this program. The yields of the call center are much higher than everything else. And I can sort of see the different groupings and how am I doing. If I take the recent calls, I can go up here, and this is the last 4 quarters. Actually see I've got some great returns in there. Let's drop down and just look at that period. So here's my call center for the last period. This is by program. Let's drop down. I can just drill this down and go down to the actual appeals, which is the actual call appeals underneath those programs. So now I'm at the actual call appeal level. And I got some phenomenally good ones. These ones are way high. So I can go in and, I don't have all the detail in this demo, but these all happened in the 4th quarter. It was this one, this one, this one. This was the reunion-themed appeal that we saw before. It was a call center appeal, so we know it's got a theme focused on reunions. I don't know what these others are. But yeah, absolutely. I mean, the goal here is you have an overall program, and it should be a few clicks to drill down and untangle what's going on underneath it. And if you want to see the people who responded to those, the entity list is now updated to, there's a group, it looks like about 40 people who, the ones I selected over here off of these appeals in the 4th quarter. Yeah, so we're out of time because I see we're right at the 3 o'clock. This webinar has been recorded, and we will have it up and out within the week. And we will also, the questions that we didn't get to answer, we will come back and answer online. So thank you very much for your time. I am going to put the PowerPoint last slide back so you can at least get the contact information one more time as we close. So thank you, and have a good rest of the day.
you.